Well, National Signing Day is less than a week away for the Ducks. Should we expect any noise going into February 1st? Here we go.
You are Locked On Ducks, your daily podcast on the Oregon Ducks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Yes, it is that time once again for Locked On Ducks. I'm your host, Spencer McLaughlin. Thank you so much for making this your first listen or your first view of the day. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your number one source to stay up to date with the Ducks. Like, comment, subscribe, please, and thank you wherever you listen to or watch this show, which today is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, official sportsbook of Locked On. Make every moment more. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn today to get started. Also want to shout out LinkedIn Jobs for being the official recruiting sponsor here at the Locked On Podcast Network, and shout out my man John Garcia Jr., our Locked On recruiting insider here. And it's a strange time, John, because there's a national signing day in less than a week, and recruiting feels, at least in Oregon's camp, kind of quiet right now, right?
A little bit. I think relatively speaking, it's quiet. But look, when you compare it and expand on the rest of the country, it's quite busy. Most programs have all but moved on to 2024, or they're looking to put together the final piece to the 23 puzzle. Maybe one recruit still out there. Oregon, technically, if all the kids do a commitment ceremony and put all the hats on the table, they should have up to 3 hats on the table. So I think it's a little bit more exciting than most, even though, yeah, compared to December or any other time, the portal, it doesn't feel as exciting and dramatic as that classic National Signing Day phrase should lead us to believe.
Yeah, we should definitely not be expecting this sort of drama, intrigue, action, actual pens on paper with regards to the Ducks as we saw back in December. But right now, Oregon's class sitting just outside the top 10 in the country, which frankly about fulfills my expectations for Dan Lanning and company after, when the job change, or the coaching change rather, was announced last year. Lanning took over. The class ended up in the top 25. I was going, man, that's a lot better than what I was hoping for or expecting. Got Josh Connerly. That was, of course, really, really big. But right now, Oregon's class sitting, I think, 12th in the country, 11th or 12th, depending on where you look. Is there a lot of room for growth in the Oregon recruiting class ranking?
Yeah, I think because, as I said, it's not as voluminous with some of these other schools in terms of the amount of prospects available. If you're trying to vault a team and it's that close, one commitment could really push you up a spot, maybe two. So if among the 3 prospects we'll talk about today, Oregon grabs one, maybe 2 of them, I don't think you get all 3, then I think you're talking about a bona fide top 10 class, Pac-12 champion, kind of same song and dance as we've become accustomed to. But obviously, if you strike out, you're probably going to stay put, because at the same time, the people behind you don't necessarily have a lot of hats on the table as well. So it's not going to move a lot in either direction for any team, in my opinion, except for maybe Colorado, which we'll talk about on another show. But otherwise, yeah, it's 1, 2, maybe 3 guys. Oregon is, believe it or not, on the high end of that prospect availability spectrum. So I do think there's room for improvement, but you're not really risking moving back and looking at a class that's going to be ranked in the 20s come February 1st.
Yeah, I think they've established for this 2023 cycle that the floor at this point, because of how many players did put pen to paper on the first National Signing Day, is pretty darn high, and there hasn't been really any rumor or speculation that I've heard that any of the guys who are, committed but haven't signed yet are in danger of getting flipped. That's probably, honestly, as I say it out loud, the biggest thing to maybe watch for on National Signing Day. There are a couple other recruits that we will certainly be looking to see if they end up choosing Oregon next Wednesday. But I think the biggest thing that Oregon can do, John, is really just stop any of their hard commits who haven't yet signed from potentially getting flipped or poached by another school.
Yeah, I'm not sure how big that number is. But yeah, in theory, if somebody hasn't signed, of course, you're always curious about somebody else swooping in. But like you said, I haven't really heard any speculation in that light. Obviously, we saw a lot of that drama and speculation building up to December 21st. not quite the same on any front heading into February 1st. And I think that's good news for the Ducks. I think it's a little bit more stable. And like you said, it kind of ensures the floor of a top 15 class at the absolute worst. But on the higher end, you're looking at a top 10 group coming to Eugene.
Are there any names that Oregon fans should be watching for that are considering Oregon and might be, iffy at best at choosing the Ducks, or maybe Oregon's in a good position, but are there any names that really Oregon fans should have their eyes on right now?
Well, if you look at this coming weekend, you got to start with Nyckoles Harbor, right?
Yeah.
The phenomenal two-sport star football and track. Your audience is probably quite familiar by now. This is one of the freakish athletes, most freakish maybe that we've ever seen. 6'5". He told me he was 233 last month running. He just ran a personal best in the 60 down at Texas Tech last weekend at that size. It's really quite remarkable. So he is going to wrap up the visit portion of his recruitment in Eugene, Oregon over a couple of days. So naturally, the Ducks have a fighting chance. They're going to get that last trip, and they're going to really prioritize him more than usual. And I say that because there's so few prospects available that all the attention for this official visit weekend is pretty much going to be on Harbor. Now, there's some young guys coming to campus, class of 24, class of 25, et cetera. But obviously, more times than not, Dan Lanning, most of these coaches are going to spend time around Harbor, and the track coaches will get involved there as well. So he's one of these kids, Spencer, that when he takes those 48 hours on the school's dime, he's using the maximum amount of time to learn of the school, because it's not just a track and football thing. This is a very high academic, ambitious prospect who wants to be a surgeon. So any academic time he can get in Eugene will be critical towards his decision-making process. So the fact that he's the only official visitor, it's the last weekend of the recruiting cycle, the whole world knows he's descending on Eugene. I mean, I think that will create a priority feel in and of itself. So once it's executed well, like we know Dan Lanning can orchestrate, the Ducks are going to feel much better about their chances of landing Harbor, who right now has a pretty wide array of programs in the mix. He put out a bit of a commitment teaser video sample the other day. 8 schools were on there. That's kind of a high number when you're 6 days away or 7 days away from a decision. So no disrespect to some of the schools on the list, Oregon, South Carolina, Michigan. I feel like those are the main players here. Miami is scratching and clawing to stay involved, but they didn't get a visit. And if you've never taken a trip to a school, hard to imagine that school winning out there in the end. But you certainly don't count out the Hurricanes in and of themselves with Mario Cristobal. But with that last official visit going to Oregon, it's a huge deal for the Ducks. Colorado had rumors of hosting him for a trip. Nyckoles himself talked about maybe getting to Miami before all is said and done, but it just doesn't look like, with this Oregon visit on deck and this busy track schedule that he's already immersed in, doesn't look like he's going to have time to get down to Coral Gables. So stranger things have happened, but as of right now, I'd be pretty surprised if the trio of Oregon, Michigan, South Carolina wasn't leading the way among these top schools ahead of that February 1st decision. And that's kind of the other bit of news here. There was at one point some thought that Harbor could push things back because, as I mentioned, it's so busy right now. He hasn't visited every school on his list, but on that same video teaser, there was a February 1st date on there. So it does appear as if Harbor is locked into that February 1st ending of the process. Remember, it's just the first day of the traditional signing period, so he doesn't have to do it. Obviously, Oregon fans well familiar based on what we saw from Josh Connerly this time last year. So keep an eye on the timeline for Harbor, but if it remains the same, you got to feel good about the Ducks getting that last official visit. It would be a bit of a comeback story, but look, Oregon's won a bunch of those recruitments in this cycle. So obviously there's a fear, there's an awareness, I should say, from these other programs of the Ducks, especially given that last visit. And honestly, that combination of football prowess and track prowess is something a lot of coaches are very tuned in of heading into this trip. So that's the biggest recruit to keep an eye on. And I know we'll talk about Rod Pleasant as well as Deuce Robinson at different points, but it's really all eyes on Harbor in the collective college football world, not just those sporting orange, or excuse me, sporting green and yellow fandom like you have so eloquently behind you.
Yeah, definitely not orange. Definitely not. The only orange we'll allow is that on Puddle's beak, right to
Technically
there.
orange.
Yeah. Technically, that's all that we can possibly stomach. I have a most fascinating question that I got from one of our wonderful listeners that I want to run by you, John. That
Sure.
you just don't want to miss, and I frankly got more intrigued by it the more I considered it. I also get intrigued by FanDuel as well because we are really excited about our new sports betting partner here at Locked On because they're the number one sports book in America, FanDuel. If you're new to FanDuel, that's even better. They have so many great features that make betting on sports fun and easy. New customers, join today. Get started with $150 in free bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. Just sign up at fanduel.com/lockedon. FanDuel has all your favorite bets from the money line to point spreads to player props. You can even work in a same game parlay if you're feeling so bold. So, football fans, don't miss out. Place your first $5 bet. Get $150 in free bets, win or lose, at fanduel.com/lockedon. Make every moment more with FanDuel, official sportsbook partner of the NFL. Here's the question I want to ask you, John. And this came from one of my listeners, who I appreciate very much here at Locked On Ducks. Harbor is probably the biggest fish in the pond remaining on the recruiting front from the prep ranks. He is certainly one of them going into National Signing Day. And you mentioned earlier how unique of an athlete he is. 6'5", 230, wants to run track. He's got a bunch of things, playing into his recruitment as well, and track being most notable there, which is why Oregon has a pretty decent chance, at least at this point in time. He is listed as an athlete coming out of high school. And someone posed the question, is it out of the realm of possibility that a guy of his size, his physical makeup, could play anything from wide receiver to safety? Like, is he that dynamic of an athlete to where if he decided to make that jump, he could do it? And the guy who it reminded me of as I was pondering that question was Isaiah Simmons, who at Clemson played safety, played linebacker, stood up and rushed the passer from time to time. Is that the sort of player athletically that Nyckoles Harbor is?
If you ask most college football coaching staffs honestly or anonymously, they would say yes. That would be the ideal transition for Harbor on the football field. The only problem is Harbor's not quite there yet defensively. A lot of it was very raw, end man on the line of scrimmage. Hey, you're just the best athlete. Go do work there. So that combined with track, as he told us, he wants to stay trim if possible. Those two items have kind of pushed Harbor towards offense. He thinks he could stay a little bit longer and leaner on that side of the ball. That's where he spent all week during the Under Armour Next All-America game week, and he actually got better as the day wore on, as the week wore on, as a pass catcher. So could it be possible on that athletic profile with development? Absolutely. He could be Isaiah Simmons 2.0, but he wants to be Kyle Pitts 2.0. I think that's the biggest difference. And track has a lot to do with it. Because, look, track is the sport where he is more unique. Not that 6'5", 230 is common in football, but it is much more common than we see on the track. And his times, 10.29 in the 100-meter dash at that size, that ceiling is intriguing, and it's going to make folks really, I would say, push for track more than anything. So if football remains a priority through that process, he's going to look to stay on the offensive side of the ball where he could stay relatively trim, even though he's already over 230 pounds. So he's not ruling anything out. He's open to playing defense. He did so in high school in the DC area, but he's most comfortable on offense, and track is pushing him towards that side of the ball just a little bit more at this point as well. But as we know, these are teenagers. Things are fluid. There's a lot of adults in his ear, no doubt. He'll have some pro prospects in track if that's a route he wants to go on top of all of this. But I think as it stands today, he's much more likely to play offense, though that athletic profile absolutely could develop into an Isaiah Simmons type, at least in principle, height, weight, speed, athleticism. Nyckoles Harbor is that type of freaky, yes.
And Devin Allen is a guy who ran at an Olympic level as a track star at Oregon, and he was a wide receiver. I was just intrigued by the thought of, a guy who wants to stay on the slimmer side. Well, maybe then he doesn't, go line up at edge, because you probably need to be like at least 250 to do that, right? 240, 250. But if he wants to be closer to 215, 220, that's the sort of guy who, if you've got high end speed, I could see being a playmaker on the back end of the defense. But certainly a guy that you just want to get on campus, regardless of what position he's going to play. He's probably going to succeed at a high level. But he's not the only guy that Oregon fans should be watching for here as we approach National Signing Day. There are really just two other names that are on Oregon's radar, because the class is already so massive, right? Like that's the biggest thing to remember here. When you don't hear a lot of news about Oregon on National Signing Day, anything I feel like we get on February 1st is kind of a bonus at this point, because the class is already so firmly set in stone. Harbor would be, of course, the highest priority bonus that I hope the Ducks are able to snag. But there are a couple other names to watch for. One of them is a tight end in Deuce Robinson, a 5-star tight end who is suddenly a target at a position of need somewhat for Oregon after Maliki Matavao and Cam McCormick both entered the portal. Right now you're looking at Terrence Ferguson, Patrick Herbert, Kenyon Sadiq, probably a true freshman. Like suddenly you want to try and maybe find some bodies there. So where does Oregon stand with Deuce Robinson, who's been a little bit of a late riser in terms of being on Oregon's radar?
Yeah, for the longest stretch, the Deuce Robinson recruitment was viewed as a classic kind of blue blood battle. USC, Alabama, Georgia, Texas was in there at various points. But yeah, Oregon is kind of the late riser, the late arriver to this party. And I think it's fascinating because you're talking about, like you said, such a position of need where, you don't have a tight end on board in this class of 23. And of course, Harbor could develop into a tight end. That's something that's seemingly obvious at this point. But in terms of polish and in terms of where he is today, I think Deuce Robinson is the unanimous number one tight end. To be unanimous in this day and age of the recruiting internet era is very rare. There's not that doesn't exist at, I would say, just about every other position, from quarterback to corner to interior pass rusher to exterior pass rusher, off-ball linebacker, maybe safety. Maybe Caleb Downs is the unanimous number one safety over Peyton Bowen. And then here, Deuce Robinson, number one tight end over everyone else, including Harbor. So that's the difference here. Not only are you going to theoretically grab somebody who is physically ready to play at 6'6", 235 pounds, but you're also getting a polished pass catcher who's ready to go right now. So it's not just the physical, it's everything else that maybe Nyckoles Harbor doesn't present technically, Deuce Robinson already has in his bag. But just like Harbor, he's a two-sport guy. He came up playing baseball and prioritized it early in his life. That's a big baseball player, I know. But look, things have changed.
So's Aaron Judge.
Exactly. Things have changed.
Seems to be working.
He kind of looks like him, too, if you watch him just smashing home runs on social media. So there's a lot of intrigue there from the baseball side. So just like Harbor might have pro prospects in track, Deuce Robinson might have pro prospects in baseball, which is a whole different animal financially, at least on the front end. So that's something to consider as well. And it makes sense why more schools are coveting more than one tight end here down the home stretch, like Oregon, because these guys have a lot on their plate. In terms of this recruitment, though, again, USC, the early favorite, I think that is abundantly clear. But since that point, other schools have made up ground. I think Georgia has probably positioned itself to have made up the most ground on USC, and you understand sort of why, right? I mean, Georgia's become tight end U overnight. They certainly utilize a lot of high value tight ends in their offense, and they're winning more than anybody over the last couple of college football seasons. So understandable in that regard. Baseball, I think Georgia was one of the first baseball offers that Deuce had there as well. But Oregon has remained on his mind. He brought up Oregon organically when we spoke to him at the Under Armour week, when he was talking about his timeline and visits. And that's the other X factor for Robinson. Of the three guys we'll talk about, he is the least set on that February 1st date. So if there is a a situation where it pushes beyond National Signing Day, like a Josh Connerly, I think Deuce Robinson is the best candidate among these final Oregon targets. He is not dead set on this commitment date. And that's the best news possible, I think, for Oregon, because similar situation, you got to get him on campus. You've got to try to get Deuce Robinson on your campus once again and give him that full gamut that you're going to give Harbor this weekend. The football side, the baseball side, the academic side, and that overall presentation. So I think that's really about as simple as it gets for Oregon. Can he push back and or make a visit to Eugene before a final decision? It could be that black and white in terms of a puncher's chance that Oregon has. But it is a school, again, he is pushing for a little bit more than maybe the recruiting industry is giving him credit for. This is being profiled as a USC-Georgia battle, but Texas, Bama, and now Oregon certainly feel like they got a puncher's chance until all the dust settles.
Oregon baseball, sneaky nice. Got some solid preseason expectations here.
He's
just throwing it out there.
Too, so that's worthy of
Can't hurt.
Arizona
Cannot hurt. Speaking of West Coast kids, we have one more to discuss, and that is Roderick Pleasant, the other name to watch for on National Signing Day. These are the three guys, Nyckoles Harbor, Deuce Robinson, Roderick Pleasant, that Oregon are in the mix for, that we know of. Maybe they will pull a rabbit out of the hat. You know, the Peyton Bowen thing, obviously it turned into a whole saga, but even getting his one-time commitment was wildly unexpected and out of the blue, came completely out of left field, pulled a rabbit out of the hat, and then we put the rabbit back in the hat, so to speak, and whatnot, and that whole debacle and such. So you never know if there are going to be surprises, but what's the latest on Roderick Pleasant, the four-star corner out of the state of California?
Yeah, your audience will be shocked to hear that he's another two-sport kid. Track star, has great times. He has times in the ballpark of Harbor. He's a lot smaller than Harbor, cornerback projection on the football field. The difference is that football is his priority. I think that's important to note with Pleasant. This is much more of a conventional, does he compete in the secondary sport, as opposed to going into it saying, hey, both of these are priorities for me, or the secondary sport is actually the primary sport relative to a football type show like we're digging into now. For Pleasant, that is the case. Football is his baby. Track is just where he might be better at this stage. But he's a very good corner, participated in the Polynesian Bowl all-star event just last week out in Hawaii, and did really well for himself. He's got a good foundation from a technical perspective, and then, of course, that athleticism, that speed, that twitch that allows him to shine on the track has become very attractive to recruit towards a defensive secondary. He's one kind of like Harbor. He's got a big group of schools, but we sort of don't believe him that it's that many still under consideration. I think it's 5 schools, no disrespect to Cal, UCLA, a couple of others, but this one is profiled like Oregon versus USC really throughout the back end of this recruitment. Now, I wouldn't count out UCLA. They did get a late visit. If there is a dark horse there, it would be the Bruins, which are certainly or suddenly recruiting at a higher clip all of a sudden. But conventionally, this feels like USC versus Oregon, and it has for quite some time. And the buzz has really tallied back and forth. The difference between him and these other guys, though, no more visits. This is all evaluation mode. Coaches have already been in to see him. He's already taken his official visits. USC did get the most recent one and the de facto final one. So I do think that probably puts a feather in Lincoln Riley's cap, but it's not done at this point. And at last check, the last interview I saw from Rod, he said he did not have an internal decision. It's really going to come down to the wire, sit down with the circle, and go from there. So you understand the appeal on both ends of this thing, track on the Oregon side, certainly, and obviously football on that side as well. And then with USC, the local school, he's got a long-standing relationship there with Dante Williams, who started recruiting him, I think, when he was a freshman. So I think that's an important factor on USC sides. And those local commitments have been heavy on him as well. I think that's another factor. So it would probably profile as a bit of an upset if Oregon was to pull this off, but I don't think there's enough confidence on either side of this battle to feel like it's done, at least as we record this. So Pleasant is still somewhat up in the air, and it's a big deal because he's obviously a guy that if you don't get him, you're going to have to play against at some point. So it always hits a little bit different when the stakes are that high on the recruiting trip.
Yeah, Oregon was in a battle for a 4-star corner last year with USC. Came down to those two schools. He ended up choosing the Ducks. His name, Jaleel Florence, who I think has a really, really high ceiling at the college level. So Roderick Pleasant, Deuce Robinson, Nyckoles Harbor, 3 names to watch for on National Signing Day for the Ducks. And we will always watch for every opportunity and every excuse we can make to bring on John Garcia Jr., our Locked On recruiting insider. Appreciate it as always, John.
Thanks for having me.
I appreciate everyone listening. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and go Ducks.